Hello everyone, good day to all of you. I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to give a review today to talk about the Trijicon RMR HD. I've been using this for a little bit over half a year, mounted on this right armory milled P30L, which I've done a separate video on if that's something you're interested in. And it's been holding up really well. Overall, this is definitely a very big upgrade over the original Trijicon, or I shouldn't say original, but the older model of the Type 2 Trijicon RMRs, such as this one right here. I have several of these, a lot of time and rounds behind them. But what I really wanted to talk about was some of the features that Trijicon improved on the RMR HD, and although, yeah, there's a lot of upgrades to it, I really wanted to kind of focus on, is it worth the upgrade? Because this actually does, at least currently, as of recording this video, is about $300 more than your normal Type 2 RMR. So let's get into it, starting first with the a little bit of a more probably boring part, but talking about the overall profile. So if you look at the RMR Type 2 down here compared to the RMR HD up here on the top, even if you look at them side by side, they really look pretty much identical in terms of their overall profile, at least as far as width and height and all that is concerned. But if you actually do take measurements on the RMR HD, it is actually ever so slightly larger in every way. Of course, what will probably stand out the most obvious, where they do have a pretty big profile increase, is here on the front. So one thing is, if you are adding a RMR HD to one of your pre-existing handguns where you've already got it milled, because the RMR HD will fit onto any of the original RMR footprints, which is nice. You don't need to get a new plate or a new milled slide or anything. But depending on how you have it milled and depending on your overall gun, how it fits and all that, you may run into an issue where the RMR HD could potentially overhang the ejection port. And if it does that, of course, you might run into issues with cycling. In the case of this, it doesn't, so I haven't ran into that issue, but I know, depending on how some people have had their slides cut, yeah, it might be an issue for you. Furthermore, the optic window itself has been ever so slightly enlarged compared to the original Trijicon, so just somewhat easier to acquire the dot. Not that I don't think it's really ever been too much of an issue once you just get the good muscle memory to index the handgun out properly, or the rifle if you do want to put this as kind of like a backup offset red dot in that regard. Then yeah, either way, I really haven't ran into any issues with that, but it is slightly larger if that's something you care about. And then next, if you look up here on the top of the optic, one other change that Trijicon did is they actually added this little ridge you'll see right here. This is an indexing ridge. I personally find this to be more of a superfluous feature. It's not something I've ever used. Trijicon describes it as being used for if you're shooting in like an abnormal stance and you're having trouble acquiring the dot, then you can kind of line that up and find the dot that way. Personally, like I said, I haven't ever used it. I haven't found it to be very beneficial. I think that, you know, maybe it'll work if you're in a really awkward shooting stance, but for the most part, if you're doing normal just range practice, then just indexing it out like normal. I've never had an issue finding it. You just kind of build that muscle memory again. So it just seems to be kind of a crutch. But as for the rest of it, you can see, yeah, it's very similar. One thing that might stand out, if you look at these buttons here on the side, it does look like they increased the size of those as well, but the actual pressable surface on these is pretty much identical. It's just that little, you can see right there, so there's the minus side, and there's the plus side there. Exactly the same as on the Type 2 RMR, so just press the plus side to turn up the brightness, push the minus side to lower it. This does have an auto adjust I will touch on a bit more later, which it works phenomenally well, actually. As far as the tactile feel, it's pretty much identical. I haven't felt any difference between the two, any appreciable difference. Maybe it's slightly more tactile on the new RMR HD, but it's very comparable to the Type 2 RMR. On the note of the buttons, so you do only have the plus and minus buttons on here, and this RMR HD has a lot of modes and different settings that you can set for it, and it's kind of extremely difficult when you're first wanting to set that. Thankfully, you never need to do that in the field, but I would definitely read the user manual and actually retain the user manual, because all the button combinations that you need, for example, to even switch between reticle mode, because they do have a kind of almost like an EOTech, not quite, I would say less usable, but they do have a reticle and they do have a dot version on here, and to just switch between those is rather complicated. Whenever I've done that in the past, I've had to look up the manual every time. But it does have a lot of customization, a lot of different brightness settings, a lot of different auto adjust settings you can do, and you can really tailor it down to how you want it to work. It's just, I kind of wish they had a different way to actually set that up and to program it. And for the rest of the controls on here, to adjust your zero, so your elevation is up here on the top of the optic, just like before, and windage adjustment is there on the right. Standard clicks, 1 MOA per click. They're very tactile and have a good amount of feedback when you're actually changing them. And last up, before I do move on to some other aspects of this optic, I did just want to go back a little bit more to the top-mounted battery because I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that. Top-mounted, so you don't need to re-zero the optic every time that you change out the battery. And you'll actually note one thing here. So you need a special tool to take this off. You'll see it has that plus head there, but it's actually the tool itself. I can show you. You will note this has a little bit of a curve to it, and that is needed to clear the roof, if you want to call it that. So you can see if it was just straight, it would collide. So it can be a little bit awkward to change the batteries. I'm on my second battery actually. My first one died after about 6 months, which is really short. Granted, I was using the reticle mode at first for about the first month and a half to 2 months, and I didn't like it personally. And to provide more context on that battery life, just so you understand what my use case is. So like I said, for the first month and a half, 2-ish months, was running this on the reticle mode. I would just wake up in the morning, put this on auto, make sure it's actually working, and then holster it and go through my day. Usually this would be on then on auto for about 10-ish hours a day. When I come home, I usually take it off of auto, set it to manual, and just drop it to the lowest setting possible. Just makes it a little bit easier, I found, just when I pick it up again in the next morning. And because I don't use this when I'm at my house, it's not a home defense weapon, I use my rifles for that. So that's why I do it that way. And then after that, 2 months, of course, I did switch to the dot mode, and then exact same sort of thing. So about 10 hours a day, putting it on auto. So if you just run it with the dot, I think you would probably end up getting more closer to the actual 3 years of continuous usage that Trijicon claims that you'd get on the battery life there. I have been practicing with this in a bunch of different weather conditions, so of course that could have impacted the battery life as well. Generally, it's just, you know, inside the waistband, so it's not under a huge amount of stress and all that, but just understand, yeah, that's, I think, mostly due to the reticle, why that battery lasted so little. But the reason I didn't like the reticle on here, especially on a handgun, so I think, first off, the reticle I think would probably work really well if you want to employ the RMR HD here as, say, a backup. So I was kind of touching on earlier, like a piggyback red dot right here, as you can see. Something like that would work well. I really, really like EOTechs and just, you know, holographic sights with an actual reticle on them for rifles, because you'll always have at least some offset, in this case, kind of a huge amount of offset, but even then, you'll always have offset, so when I'm out at distance, I'll know my holdovers if I'm needing to use, you know, that for any reason. And similarly, if I'm at closer ranges where I'm having to deal with the barrel to optic offset, then it's a lot easier to just gauge it off of there. Usually, for example, say on this EOTech, I know to aim at the very, very bottom of the ring when I'm at closer ranges, like 15 meters. And you could kind of employ a similar thing with the RMR HD. Like I said, the reticle is different. I think it's less usable overall. The EOTech reticle just is incredibly well thought out from my experience and works great. And additionally, the other issue, and the reason I changed off of a reticle when I was using it on here, was it just blocked a lot of the target, a lot of the information, even when you have both eyes open. I'd like to just see that, I think as Ben Stoker described it, just you see that flash of red go over the target, and you're not really focusing on the dot itself, and you just fire. When I have that huge reticle, it's just information overload to an extent, and I just would prefer not to have that when I'm shooting handguns. So just a dot is personally what I like, and it's really what I would stick with if you're going to mount it onto here, which may also be kind of a point you might want to consider, is if you even want the RMR HD, because it is a pretty big feature. They advertise a lot with it. Maybe you would just want to get the older RMR with just a dot. Moving on, I did want to just briefly touch on the durability of this optic. It's a Trijicon RMR. They have a good reputation for being extremely durable. I'm absolutely not going to do a torture test. That would be redundant because there's already a lot of really, really well done torture tests out there. For example, one that I really like when this optic first came out, if you're interested in it, just check out Sage Dynamics review on YouTube. He did a really good torture test. I think he does some of the best optic torture tests personally, and yeah, these hold up great. As far as my own use case, thousands of rounds on here, reciprocating on this slide, and it had no issues whatsoever. It's holding on here good, it's still holding 0, and the dot is still nice and bright. Speaking of the dot looking kind of nice, that does remind me, I wanted to talk about the glass quality. So it is pretty good. You can see here on the camera, and it's not going to look exactly like it does in real life. The camera never picks this sort of thing up very well. but it does have a fair bit of tint to it. I personally do prefer the much clearer optics. Again, like an EOTech, granted, they do the tint to have a little bit better battery life, especially when you're shooting at, for instance, twilight, right around the time when it's just dark enough where you can't see very well with the naked eye, but also lights don't do a whole lot, especially then. When I'm out hunting, granted not with this optic, but I have noticed a lot of times I'm trying to shoot at game around then, and it's just so hard to see them through an aim point, for instance, and something like this, same sort of thing. So I would personally prefer they'd have less tint, but I will say as far as the glass quality itself, it is nice and clear. There's no distortions or anything, just the whole thing is nice, and the tint is consistently applied throughout. I know some other optics I've looked at in the past don't really do that, but this is good. To conclude, bring it back to the question I raised at the start of this video, is the RMR HD a worthwhile upgrade to the Type 2 RMR? And what I would say is if you already own a Type 2 RMR, personally, I wouldn't bother upgrading. If you're getting a new gun, a new setup, then I would say, yeah, go ahead and pick up an RMR HD instead. But I think that's also going to be really use case dependent, because remember, as of making this video, this is about $700, so usually approximately $300-ish more expensive than the Type 2 RMR. You can still get these pretty easily. Euro Optics is where I picked up all of these. They have really good prices most of the time. But the feature set, for instance, if you want the reticle and you're planning to use it on a handgun, I would say it's probably not worth it in that regard, at least from what I've experienced and when I've been shooting it. If you want it for more of a offset red dot, I could see it being more useful there. The auto adjust feature, I didn't actually touch on that too much, but I will say that the auto adjust on here has worked incredibly well for me. The biggest improvement you'll see here with the auto adjust is first and foremost the lighting sensor for the ambient lighting conditions has been moved to the front of the optic, so it's reading the lighting off of the target, or at least closer to it, which is a huge benefit, especially if you're using a weapon mounted light or just the target is in a brighter or darker area compared to where you're shooting from, then it'll adjust dependent on that, rather than just being the lighting around you as the user. It just makes it a lot less likely that you'll run into an issue where you can't see the dot if you turn on your light. Also, another improvement that Trijicon did make is that there is a lot less latency now between when the dot brightens compared to the ambient lighting conditions changing. I never really did a whole lot with the auto adjust on my old RMRs because it just didn't work very well. One issue was it took so long for the dot to actually brighten up after I would turn on the light or go from a dark area to a brighter area, or even just pulling it out of the holster. I could visibly see, even by the time that I've acquired the sights, that it's still brightening up. Now on the RMR HD, you still do have a little bit of latency. I wasn't able to actually record any footage of this because changing the lighting conditions kept messing up the camera, as you might expect, but it's very, very little. It's a fraction of what it was before. How important that feature is to you also, it may depend. I know a lot of people that carry this type of dot, or myself included, when I carried this one, which is just a manual, I would usually just have it a little bit on the bright side because especially when you use the light, even if you're in a dark area, it's going to balance out pretty well and you'll still be able to see the dot. Ultimately, if you're wanting a definite yes or no answer on whether the RMR HD is worth the $300 extra, it's really not something I can answer for you. It's really going to depend on your own budget. Like I said, for me, I would say, at least for a handgun like this, I would say, yeah, it's worth it. I'm still absolutely not going to be replacing on my other handguns like this older P320. I'm just going to leave this probably permanently with the Type 2 RMR until it either breaks or I sell this gun or something. The top mount battery is really nice. On the other hand, it's not that much work to just take off the RMR and just really quickly re-zero it. Usually it's not that far off, if at all, anyway, especially if you're doing it to the same torque level. But it is kind of a nice quality of life feature to have the top mounted battery. But I just hope that through this video you found some good information and hopefully it helped you make a decision either way. So hope it helped, and if you have any other questions on this or on whatever on the RMRs, then by all means let me know. I'll try my best to get back to you if you do have a question. Otherwise, any other comments, always welcome. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you all in the next one. See you then.